5 abiotic factors that can affect plant growth. As altitude increases, the temperature and the concentration of water vapor in the air decreases. At higher altitudes, air pressure decreases and there are fewer molecules of gas present in the air. This means that there is less CO2 in the air. The combination of the above factors greatly inhibits plant growth. Sunlight is crucial for plants. It plays a major role in the process of photosynthesis, the method by which plants produce their food and grow. However, some plants cannot survive direct sunlight exposure as the rate of transpiration will exceed the rate of water intake and the plant will wilt and die as a result. Many plants have adaptations which allow them to cope with varying levels of sunlight exposure. Soil pH is the measure of acidity and alkalinity in soils. pH levels range from 0 to 14, with 7 being neutral, below 7 acidic, and above 7 alkaline. The optimal pH range for most plants is between 5.5 and 7.0. Soil pH affects the availability of nutrients necessary for plant growth and can also affect the composition of soil. Highly acidic or alkaline soils are often sticky and this hinders root growth. Wind can be both beneficial and detrimental towards plant growth. It can aid in pollination, and moderate winds help strengthen saplings' internal support structures. However, gale force winds can completely uproot even large sturdy trees, and constant wind exposure can lead to malformation whereby the tree is bent by the prevailing wind. Water is necessary for all living things. It is vital in the chemical reactions within cells and acts as a lubricant and as a medium for carrying dissolved substances. All plants need access to water, but some are adapted to be less dependent on it than others. Oversaturation of water can also be detrimental. It can cause roots to rot and the plant will die as a result. Sexual reproduction occurs when a male sex gamete fuses with a female sex gamete to form a zygote. Sexual reproduction generally creates offspring that are genetically different to their parents. This genetic difference gives offspring adaptations that could allow them to survive in a changing environment. In plants, this would only occur if the flower cone of a plant has been cross-pollinated by another plant of the same species. The downside of sexual reproduction is that it is energy intensive and that the offspring are not numerous. Asexual reproduction occurs when a single parent cell splits to form an identical copy of itself. In plants, this is seen in the growth of algae and in part of the reproductive cycle of bryophytes. Asexual reproduction creates many offspring and is not energy intensive. However, the offspring have no genetic variation from their parents and do not have adaptations that can allow them to survive in changing environments. Bryophytes are primitive land plants, first appearing in the Silurian period 435 to 410 million years ago, that lack vascular tissue and reproduce via spores. Common examples of bryophytes are mosses. Bryophytes are most commonly found near bodies of water and areas with a high humidity, provided that they are not exposed to direct sunlight. Bryophytes are known to grow on trees as well, but are never parasitic. Bryophytes are very low-lying plants, as they lack sufficient supportive structure and vascular tissue to grow tall. They lack cuticles, meaning that they can absorb a lot of water, but also run the risk of drying out fast if exposed to direct sunlight. Therefore, bryophytes have to grow in moist, shady environments. Bryophytes reproduce both asexually and sexually. When the sporophyte generation of the bryophyte matures, spores are released from the sporangium, and if they landed in a favorable location, germinate to produce a protonema that develops into either male or female branches of the gametophyte generation. On top of the male part of the plant, a cluster of sperm-producing antheridium develops. On top of the female part of the plant, a cluster of egg-producing archegonia develops. Once the sperm inside the antheridium have matured, they are released. As the sperm are not encased in a protective medium such as pollen, water is necessary for fertilization in bryophytes. Fertilization occurs when one sperm cell fuses with one egg cell to form a zygote. The zygote develops into an embryo that eventually develops into a new sporophyte generation. The sporophyte generation then matures, whereby spores are produced through meiosis inside the sporangium, and the cycle is repeated. Specific mosses are used to make peat. Peat is a material that is comprised of dried and compressed moss and is used for burning and insulation. Pteridophytes are seedless vascular plants that reproduce via spores. Pteridophytes first began to appear in the early Devonian period, about 410 million years ago. Common examples of pteridophytes are ferns. The main abiotic environments that pteridophytes are found in are moist shady forests, crevices and rock faces that are sheltered from full sun exposure, acidic wetlands, and humid tropical rainforests. Pteridophytes have vascular tissue, meaning that they have more structural support and can grow much taller than bryophytes. They also have cuticles on their leaves, allowing them to conserve water better and are hardier against sun exposure. Pteridophytes' spores are located on the underside of their leaves in sacs called sori. The spores are released when the fronds begin to dry up and contract. This contraction causes the sori to burst, releasing the spores. Water is needed for fertilization, as the male sex gametes are not held in a protective casing like pollen, and therefore need a medium to swim through in order to fertilize the female sex gamete. When spores are released and land in a body of water, they develop into a heart-shaped structure called a prothallus. On the prothallus are the antheridium that produced a male sex gamete and the archegonia that produced a female sex gamete. The male sex gametes swim from the antheridium to the archegonia, where one male sex gamete fuses with one female sex gamete to form a zygote that will develop into a new shoot that will become a new fern. Some ferns are known to be used for primitive medicine, but are largely used for aesthetic purposes these days. Gymnosperms are a group of seed-producing vascular plants. They began to appear in the late Devonian period, about 360 million years ago. Gymnosperms are hardy plants. They are generally very woody and will have tough spiny leaves. They have taproots that go deep down into the ground, making them less reliant on surface water and also making them more stable and difficult to uproot. Many gymnosperms grow very tall, making their leaves unreachable to ground animals, and their female cones are very difficult to break open. Because of the above reasons, gymnosperms can survive a multitude of environments and can withstand attacks from a multitude of potential predators due to their hardy exterior. The word gymnosperm literally means naked seeds. This name was derived for the group as the seeds are not protected by a fruit. Gymnosperms produce both male and female cones. The male cones carry pollen, and the female cones contain the archegonia that carry eggs. As the male sex gametes are encased in pollen, they do not need water in order to reach the eggs. The pollen is transported to the female cone through pollination. When pollen is transferred to the female cone, it enters the archegonia and then enters the ovule. Once inside the ovule, the male sex gametes mature and are either released and swim to the egg, or a pollen tube grows from the pollen grain directly to the egg, whereby sperm is transferred down the tube to the egg. Fertilization occurs when one male sex gamete fuses with an egg and forms a zygote. The zygote develops into an embryo, and the ovule expands and becomes a food supply for the embryo. The ovule's exterior hardens to become a protective layer known as the seed coat. At a specific time interval, the female cones split open, releasing the fully developed seeds. The petals of a flower are modified leaves that attract pollinators. The number of petals on a flower depend on whether the plant is a monocot or a dicot. If the number of petals is divisible by 3, then it is a monocot. If it is divisible by 4 or 5, it is a dicot. The largest tree species on Earth is a gymnosperm, and their wood is widely used for construction. The angiosperms are a huge group of seed-producing vascular flowering plants. Angiosperms began to appear in the early Cretaceous period, about 135 million years ago. The angiosperms are incredibly diverse. They can survive a multitude of different climates and are found almost everywhere on Earth. Angiosperms can range from low-lying scrub to tall trees to arid succulents and cacti. They all have adaptations that suit their environmental conditions and the fauna that are found in those conditions. Angiosperms are flowering plants. The flowers attract animals and insects that can aid in the pollination process by having colorful petals and or having a strong odor that can attract specific pollinators and deter predators. Flowers comprised of 4 main parts: the stem that the flower buds are from, the petals, the stamens, and the pistil. On the stem are the sepals and the receptacle. The sepals are modified leaves that surround the flower and are the first part of the flower to form. The receptacle is a thickened part of the stem that holds the flower and eventually the fruit. The petals of a flower are modified leaves that attract pollinators. The number of petals on a flower depend on whether the plant is a monocot or a dicot. If the number of petals is divisible by 3, then it is a monocot. If it is divisible by 4 or 5, it is a dicot. A monocot is a flowering plant that has 1 cotyledon on germination, and a dicot is a flowering plant that has 2 cotyledons on germination. Both types of plants also have their own unique root and vein systems. Stamens are located around the pistil and made up of 2 parts, the filament and the anther. The filament holds up the anther, and the anther produces pollen. The pistil is located in the center of the flower and is comprised of 3 parts: the stigma, the style, and the ovary, which contains ovules. The stigma is a sticky landing bed for pollen grains. The style is a long tube that connects the stigma to the ovary, and the ovary encases the ovules that contain the female sex gametes. As angiosperms are pollen-producing plants, water is not necessary for fertilization to occur. For fertilization to occur, pollination has to occur first. The pollen on the anther is transported to the stigma of the flower. Angiosperms can both self-pollinate and cross-pollinate with other plants of the same species. Cross-pollination creates offspring that are genetically different to its parents. When the pollen grain lands on the stigma, it grows a long tube down to the ovary via the style and then inserts itself into an ovule. The male sex gamete in the pollen grain is released and travels down the tube to the ovule where it fuses with an egg. Fertilization has occurred, a zygote forms and begins to develop into an embryo encased by a seed. The ovary expands and the other parts of the flower fall off. Over time, the ovary develops into a protective and nutrient-rich covering called a fruit. Inside the fruit is the embryo encased in the seed. If the seed lands in a favorable location, it will germinate and develop into a new plant. Angiosperms have a huge variety of uses, from agriculture to medicine to perfume. They also have major aesthetic value and can be very attractive.